Hello, this is another one of my videos on Alistair Parker's short history of the Second World War, this one dealing with the Soviet Union and the West. It's quite a long chapter, so I've divided it into three separate videos, the first one dealing mostly with Poland. So a basic question is, what held the Grand Alliance, as it's termed here, together? The Grand Alliance of the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States won the war. At times, both sides feared that the other might try to reach a separate understanding with the Germans, but this would have been impossible for a number of reasons. First, Hitler was well known to be untrustworthy. Secondly, the Nazi regime was inimical to both liberal democracy and communism. There would be no advantage if the Nazi regime remained in place. A deal would only be possible with like-minded Germans who were evidently unable to overthrow the Nazis. Thirdly, to collaborate with the Nazis would enable them to survive, to play off the Soviets versus the Western Allies, and so prolong the basis for the conflict. And lastly, the Nazis could only be got rid of by continuing the anti-German alliance. Hitler had kept the alliance against him together, but could it survive his death? If the Soviets and the Western powers continued to cooperate, they could secure world peace. In the West, and probably in the Soviet Union also, most people hoped for continuing cooperation, perhaps with the aid of France and China, to keep the peace and enforce agreed-upon principles. The alternative would be the division of the world into spheres of influence by the Big Three, or perhaps the Big Five, whether by agreement or by conflict between them. The arrival of the Red Army on the outskirts of Warsaw in July 1944 was the first clear sign that a division into spheres of influence might be the end outcome. That is what later came to be called the Cold War. At the end of July, German civilians began to leave the city, and on the 28th of July there was a direct appeal for a general Polish insurrection against the Germans. On the 1st of August, armed Polish resistance fighters seized control of parts of the city and attacked the German occupiers. These were members of the Polish Home Army, loyal to the Polish government in exile in London, and not to the Soviet-sponsored Polish Committee of National Liberation set up in Lublin by the Soviets after the Red Army had taken the city. If the Home Army was successful, then anti-Soviet Poles, who objected to the earlier Soviet conquest of eastern Poland in 1939, would be in control in Warsaw. What should the Soviets do? Stalin wanted a friendly Polish government established and Polish acceptance of the earlier Soviet conquest of the lands east of the 1919 Kherson Line. But to abandon the Poles in their heroic struggle against some of the most barbaric of the German forces would not look good to Western opinion. There was thus some prevarication, and the Soviets did drop some supplies to the Poles and allowed the Lublin Poles to try to relieve Warsaw, but overall the response was too muted. The Red Army itself waited on the far side of the river, whilst the Germans crushed the Polish rebellion. The Soviets had denounced the Polish insurgents as reckless and criminal adventurers, and delayed allowing Western aircraft, including Polish squadrons serving with the RAF, to land on Soviet airfields to refuel. London Poles also suspected that Soviet actions were a deliberate policy to allow the Germans to destroy the anti-Soviet Polish forces, although Parker thinks that this was unlikely. The Polish Home Army felt it had to fight. If it didn't, it would lose popular Polish support to the rival Lublin Poles. The Warsaw uprising had two results. First, it showed very clearly what Soviet policies were towards the Poles. Secondly, it led to the total defeat of the Home Army with 5,000 of their armed soldiers lost, as well as the deaths of up to 200,000 Polish people. After weeks of desperate struggle, the Home Army surrendered to the Germans on the 4th of October. Their underground state was drastically weakened, and without weapons was left unable to resist the Lublin Committee. There was much sympathy for the Poles in the West, particularly in Britain, where many people remembered how little support the Poles had received in 1939. But there was little action. The Soviet-backed Lublin Poles were the de facto winners and the only Polish government recognized by the Soviets. Churchill was sympathetic, but he also partly blamed the Polish government in exile in London for its intransigence in refusing to accept the Curzon Line as their state's new eastern border. If they'd done so, then it might have been possible to get the Soviets to accept an at least semi-independent Poland at the end of the conflict. To this end, Churchill and his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, flew to Moscow for 10 days on the 10th of October, berating the London Poles for not accepting the Curzon Line. Despite regarding the Lublin Poles as the greatest villains imaginable, his words, he made it clear to the London Poles that he would not wreck the peace of Europe because of quarrels between Poles. So this is the Curzon Line, shown in blue. It was established, proposed I should say, by the Allied War Council in 1919 as the eastern border of Poland. But in a subsequent war between the Poles and the newly emergent Soviet Union, the Poles conquered the area shown in grey there to the east. And this was basically the area taken by the Soviet Union in 1939 after the Germans first had invaded Poland. The other thing I should mention about this map is that the areas shown in pink are the areas which were subsequently transferred from Germany at the end of World War II to the new Polish state. So that indicates the final outcome of World War II in terms of the borders of Poland. We should note that the British and the Americans had earlier dismissed the German discovery of mass graves in 1943, containing the bodies of around 22,000 Polish officers and others evidently murdered by the Soviets in 1939 at Katyn near Smolensk. The Allies, Western Allies, seeing these claims as a German propaganda trick. When the Polish government in London had requested an impartial inquiry in April of 1943, the Soviets had broken diplomatic relations with them and later recognized the Lublin Committee, which was set up under its aegis as the only legitimate government. In his visit in October 1944, Churchill was well received in Moscow and appears to have accepted Soviet predominance in Poland with the acquiescence of Avril Harriman acting as American observer. Churchill and Stalin also, separately from the Americans, agreed between them that whilst Romania would be in the Soviet sphere of influence at the end of the war, Greece would be in that of the British in accord with the Americans. Bulgaria would also be under Soviet influence, whilst Hungary and Yugoslavia would be under the joint influence of the British and the Soviets. The Polish Prime Minister in London, Stanislaw Mikołajczyk, I'm sorry if I totally mispronounced his name, resigned rather than accept these arrangements and was replaced by a new and more rejectionist Polish government in exile. As the Soviet advance through Poland commenced, the Lublin Poles were installed by them as its government, and with the support of Soviet troops attacked the remnants of the Polish Home Army still loyal to the government in London. This is the famous jotting of notes on the agreement between Churchill and Stalin about post-war spheres of influence with Russia, Soviet Union, having a 90% influence in Romania and a 75% influence in Bulgaria, Britain having a 90% influence in Greece, and Yugoslavia and Hungary roughly 50-50. In 1945, the big three powers decided the future of the post-war world at two major meetings, represented first by Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill at Yalta in the Crimea in February, and then by Stalin, the new American President Truman, and Churchill, soon replaced by Attlee at Potsdam in August. Their differences were now evidently insurmountable, both regarding Germany, which we'll talk about in a later video, and Poland. Stalin appears to have been satisfied with establishing a safe zone of friendly states around the borders of the Soviet Union so as to secure security from external threats. This is a photograph of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. And this is a photograph of Churchill, Truman, and Stalin at the first part of the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. The British had a general election at this time, and Churchill was replaced by Clement Attlee as the new Prime Minister. So here we have a picture from later in the Potsdam Conference of Attlee, Truman, and Stalin. The Americans, supported to a lesser extent by the British, insisted that the principles of the Atlantic Charter should be applied everywhere, including universal suffrage, free elections of representative legislative assemblies, freedom of expression for minorities, respect for property rights, and the removal of international barriers to trade and investment. But in Poland, it would be impossible to have a democratic government that accepted subservience to the Soviet Union. For the Soviets, this was not negotiable. Soviet security needs for them had to override Polish aspirations for their own full independence. Eventually, despite considerable tensions and fears even of a new war between the Soviets and the West, a new division into spheres of influence emerged, and the presence of the Red Army in Poland ensured that it would be in the Soviet zone. Elsewhere, the British and Americans ensured that the Soviet Union would not have any influence in Italy, and British troops landed in Greece to replace the Germans and to ensure that the Greek communists, who were a major element in the resistance to the Germans, were kept out of power. Stalin accepted both of these actions. So, thank you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement. Without them, I wouldn't be able to make these videos. If you want to support my channel, you're very welcome to do so. Please do like, comment, and share on the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos, and I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll continue with this chapter on the Soviet Union and the West and talk about growing tensions between the two. Have a good day.